Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session with my three distinguished panelists on fake news. Never mind needing an extra part from the heating, I think that there's no other topic at this conference that's going to get people's temperature rising probably more than these two words, infuriating any journalist: fake news. I think, first of all, I'd like to start by just thinking a little bit about what fake news actually is. I think it means something very different perhaps to the journalistic community it does to the US president, or indeed the people who consume news every day in all its different formats these days. So fresh off the press, while we're all sort of warming ourselves in this room, is the European Commission Vice President Timmermans has just announced that the EU is seeking feedback now due to a quote-unquote nearly overwhelming volume of misinformation and fake news that it suspects may have been used to influence elections in France, in the UK, in Germany, and also the recent upheaval in Catalonia. So they're seeking views on how to combat this in the first quarter of 2018. Of course, I think we'll still be a member then, just about, so let's hope they figure it out before we leave. So I'd just like to start off by introducing our panelists. So Will Moy, leader of the independent fact-checking company Full Fact. Keith Harrison, editor of the Express and Star, one of the most successful regional newspapers in the country. And welcome Peter Barron, who of course is our representative from Google. He's the Vice President of Communications for EMEA. And obviously we heard from his colleague Ronan Harris last night, who was very good about taking everyone's very tough questions that we have with regard to Google. You're not a representative of all three tech companies, you assure me, in Silicon Valley. And I think we should applaud Google for showing up and taking everyone's questions. Originally, this panel was also going to have a representative from Facebook, would have perhaps been a little bit more balanced, but due to work pressures, just Google is the representative of the big three. So, I think it's very fair say thank you for taking our questions and spending the time here. And we can only hope that Facebook is busy working away at how to combat fake news in the meantime. So without further ado, I'd like to open what is bound to be a very heated discussion on this topic, just to ask all three of you, what is fake news and how does it impact your line of business and what you're doing every day? Where do you see it manifesting itself most? So Will, do you want to take it away?
Well, I'd love to, actually, because I'd like to start by putting it from the opposite direction. Some of you will have seen the work recently done by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. They did focus groups with the public, asking them what they understood by the term fake news. And I think that is a very important angle on this debate. Their summary includes people see the difference between fake news and news as one of degree rather than a clear distinction. Fake news is experienced as a problem driven by a combination of some news media who publish it, some politicians who contribute to it, and some platforms that help distribute it. And they say the fake news discussion plays out against a backdrop of low trust in news media, politicians, and platforms alike, a generalized skepticism towards most of the actors that dominate the contemporary information environment. Now, Full Fact, we've been going 7 years, we've been going since 2010. We exist to stop the spread of specific unsubstantiated claims in public life and to promote the availability of reliable information. You'd expect the current moral panic about fake news to be fascinating and helpful to us. And although it has brought focus on the kind of work we do, I actually see it as an absolutely malign discussion. This generalized skepticism is so very visible, particularly among the younger generation, which is most internet-centric. And I think that we will find that there is an easy and obvious and rational reaction to all the fuss about fake news, which is simply believe nothing that you see. And that is actually the worst possible reaction. So the challenge for fact-checkers in the next 10, 20 years might well be not to get people not to believe things that aren't true, but to persuade people to be willing to believe anything that they don't want to hear. And I think that's a challenge for news publishers too. It's interesting to note that part of the backdrop to the European Commission's activity, they have a big conference on in Brussels at the moment that a colleague is speaking at, is the fear of state-sponsored disinformation, particularly from Russia. And one of the stated goals of that, apparently, is to foment this skepticism. It's not actually necessary to persuade people to believe specific things that aren't true. It's enough to kick up enough dust that people give up on the premise of a shared democratic debate. And I think newspapers should be doing anything but welcoming the debate on fake news. We need to be breaking it down into distinct, meaningful problems that can be tackled and solved, and getting rid of a term that has basically started to be used just to abuse journalists.
Right, so Keith, would you like to pick up on that point as regards, running successful regional newspaper? But as we were talking about earlier, it's very hard sometimes, to get the correction out to the world in the same time frame that sometimes the inaccurate version appears, for example.
It is, and I think in the wider sense, I think Will's done a good job there of outlining what the issue of fake news is. I think one of the key things there, the key word was scepticism. And I think if we can encourage scepticism, that people will, most of these fake news stories fall apart at the first attempt at verification. I think the vast majority, not the one that Chris was mentioning earlier on, that went for years. But I think from the regional press perspective, there isn't the low trust in the local media that there may be, certainly online. I'm doing everything I can to try and help that. However, I think social media is one of the areas rather than print. Because I knew I was speaking here today, I did a little experiment yesterday whereby I put out a tweet that said that I'd been for a 10-mile walk before breakfast up in the Lake District. Anybody who knows me knows that I don't do anything before breakfast, and I certainly don't go for a 10-mile walk. And yet this tweet was liked. I know like doesn't mean that they believed it. Was liked by, and I won't name these people, another newspaper editor, a local MP, and the chief photographer who's probably put it in the UGC file and it's lined up for page 4 in tomorrow's paper. I will apologise to them and delete that after this session, but it just goes to show how these things can be taken, and the first sense of verification, if any of them rung me up and said, Keith, you went for a 10-mile walk? And of course I didn't. And I think the fakers and fake news is reliant on us not doing our jobs properly, and the way to combat them is to make sure that we do.
And Peter, you in many ways have a unique perspective into this, having spent most of your career as a journalist and now work for Google. And obviously the really key question, I think, for all of us is what specifically is, as Will said, we need to break this problem down into manageable chunks. Can you address how Google can break that down and what its role can be in addressing that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Will's point about the generalised use of the term in a very wide debate is right, that it's not particularly helpful. I think it's much better to focus on the individual cases. And I would just start by saying that Google's entire purpose throughout our history has been to take people to relevant and high quality information. So we're fully signed up in the battle against misinformation. I think it's also worth saying that this is, although fake news is a new phenomenon, the idea of deception or misinformation online has been around right from the beginning. We used to call it spam. Spam is an attempt to deceive the user or to claim to be something you're not. So we've had search quality teams working on the issue of spam for many years. Fake news is a new incarnation of that, but is a continuation. I think it's worth just, I think, spending a little bit of time on the definition. I think DCMS's definition is as good as any that are doing the rounds. Fake news is news or information that is based on a lie with the intention of deliberately misleading people, which I think is a good place to start. Obviously, there are different incarnations of that. We saw the first, I suppose, celebrated one around the US elections, making money, which is really the Macedonian teenagers. They hadn't really any interest in Donald Trump at all. It's just they realised that people were clicking on it. So that was the money-making model. Then, of course, we have the political imperative, the state-sponsored actors, and then much more broad use of the term would be news that people don't like, or highly partisan news, and I think we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. But in terms of how we are seeking to combat these problems, I would break it down into three broad areas. First, search quality. Secondly, choking off money. And third, promoting and working with the industry to promote high quality news. So in terms of search quality, we've done we continue to do a lot in terms of ranking changes. We make more than 1,000 ranking changes a year in terms of our algorithms. It's very much an unsolved problem. We're constantly trying to get to a better place. But of the billions of searches that we handle every day in a fraction of a second, we reckon we're doing a very good job of taking people to relevant and useful information. But of course, we have seen some problems cropping up. So, for example, in the course of the last year, we saw for a particular search around did the Holocaust happen, we were surfacing results that were not true and were problematic. We made ranking changes to address that problem, and it's a much better experience now. We've added a fact check label to both to Google News and to search. So where fact checking is going, whether it's Full Fact or Channel 4 News or other organisations who are routinely doing fact checking on stories, we now surface that in Google News with a little label saying fact check on it. I had a little look this morning, and a couple of stories that popped up. Spice Girls reunion is not happening. Apparently, that was fake news. And Malia Obama did not get arrested in an anti-fascist attack on an old lady. So and you'll see those when you go to Google News. Something that we just put in place in recent days again is more labelling around the sources. So we've introduced in the States in the first place knowledge panels around the publishers of news, giving information about the kind of content that a news publisher has, awards they've won, contested stories, etc. So I think a lot of more information about the source of content is very important. On the second point, which is choking off the money supply, yes, that's very much the Macedonian case study. We put in place something called the misrepresentative ads policy. So if someone is pretending to be something else, if a Macedonian teenager is pretending to be an American news site, that is misrepresentation. So we choke off the money and disable the ability to make money from that. And I saw a piece the other day talking to 16-year-old Macedonian kids who said, business has dried up. We used to be fake news purveyors, but that business isn't working any longer. And then thirdly, and this is really, I think, fits into the whole idea of fighting for real news, is working more broadly with the industry to surface and promote high quality news. So Google News, for example, is 80,000 verified publishers. And we're also working with a range of fact-checking organisations. We're making money available through the Digital News Initiative to new endeavours. Actually, we worked with Will's organisation around automated fact-checking, and there's a prototype in place for that. We also work with the Trust project with the Marquette University in California, which has been going on this actually before the whole issue of fake news erupted. And again, that's around creating clearer signals around news stories that are published with the aim of surfacing high quality content. So that's just a range of some of the things we're doing. I think it's worth just saying one point about what we don't and shouldn't do. Clearly, no one can prevent fake news or things that are not true being uploaded to the web. I don't think anyone would want us to be an arbiter of what is true and what is false. And we are seeing some calls for that kind of thing to happen. That would be a dangerous area, we think.
Keith, do you want to pick up a little bit on one of those points you mentioned earlier, which is, just getting in touch with Google or Facebook or Twitter to take something off that you know to be incorrect, and you mentioned that can be quite a time-consuming process. And Peter, perhaps could you respond to that in sort of how can there be more direct links between quality journalists and Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., in terms of making sure the correct content is in front of readers' eyes and not the incorrect version, which, you know, unfortunately often is read several times more than the corrected one that follows?
I think really this comes down to what is Google, whether Google is a publisher or not. I think the case in question, without going into too many details, is that we published an inaccurate report, which was only online for a couple of hours and seen by a couple of hundred people, which then we removed fairly quickly as soon as we realised that it was wrong. Removing that from the Google search check took days and days, Pete, as we contacted the Google, went through all the processes, and now it is subject to an IPSO investigation and, you know, potential legal action, yet the responsibility for that lies with us. Now, some people would say, well, you made the mistake, Kate, so, you know, you've got to take the responsibility for it. But actually, potentially, that was disseminated more and published on a wider basis by Google rather than by us as the content creator.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen many cases of this over the years where a publisher publishes something, you know, inadvertently or something that is wrong and wants it to disappear. And of course, there is a process for alerting us to that and having that part of the web recrawled.
It's slow.
It can be expedited, and actually, of course, there is the filling in the form process, but actually many publishers have come to us and said that we put up a piece inadvertently, can we get that down quickly? And we're able to expedite that process. So I'll give you my details and you can get in touch with me.
Oh, it's down now.
If others in the room find themselves in similar situations, do get in touch with me.
I mean, the case for that though is if, in its worst example, that would end up in court, and me and Tony Jaffa have to stand up in court, will anybody from Google be there alongside us? I suspect not.
Well, the publisher is ultimately responsible for the material. We're obviously helping people find that material. But what, if something is changed, of course you can put a correction on the story. But of course you can also get it removed in due course.
So how would that be expedited now? What would you recommend to editors of newspapers and other publications trying to get those corrections out in front of people, that it's not taking days and perhaps?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's an online form, which my feeling is that it does happen reasonably swiftly. But I mean, you can certainly, particularly in an emergency, and over the years we've had a few emergencies where people have put up things which are, are libelous or dangerous. You can get in touch with me or my team, and we can get that done very quickly.
Okay.
I wish I'd have known that 6 weeks ago.
For learning process.
So I'd just like to come back. I mean, obviously we just had a very interesting presentation from Oric Koppel about Wiki Tribune. And I find it rather striking that, as a group of journalists, we're now sort of somewhat reliant on charitable voluntary organisations to go out and get the story straight and in front of people, and Will, this speaks to what you do, can David really fight Goliath on this front, really?
I suppose it depends what you think is the problem you're trying to solve. Full Fact, as I said, tries to stop specific inaccurate claims being made and spread and to promote good information being available. If we tried to solve the problem of people believing things that aren't true, we'd be a very different organisation that would have to work at a much larger scale. And even in the charity sector would be an interesting prospect. That coming from multinational businesses and governments would be a fairly terrifying prospect. So I'm not sure that we should imagine that people believing things that are not true as a problem to be solved in quite such a direct way. I think it is striking that Full Fact exists and that it exists as a charitable organisation funded largely by individual donors, a bit like Wiki Tribune, and by charitable trusts. We've had funding from Google, as Peter says, through the Digital News Initiative, and also with Facebook as well for our work at the election, tracking misinformation online with First Draft, the global experts who've also done that with Crosscheck in France and Valcheck in Germany. We exist in the context of a world in which there are fewer specialist journalists than there used to be a generation ago. There are fewer news outlets, actually, sadly, than there used to be a generation ago. There are journalists producing more content for more platforms in less time than ever before. And so it's actually not very surprising in a way that some of the safeguards of the journalism process have been eroded in that context. And that has partly created the space in which full fact's existence makes some kind of sense. So as a publisher ourselves, as a journalism outfit ourselves, we do something, some of which at least would have been just a routine part of newsrooms a generation ago, and is a routine part of some newsrooms in at least some contexts, but is perhaps not as well established as it used to be. We also do things that no newsroom does. So, for example, I'm very, very pleased that BBC Reality Check has got set up. Channel 4 Fact Check was actually going, their online blog, before Full Fact got going. Those are great things. Those are journalistic outfits showing their audiences that this is something we care about. Sorry, they're not more tightly integrated into the main editorial product, actually, but it's nonetheless a valuable thing. What we do that those organisations don't do, which I think is very distinctively charitable, is talk about what the evidence from thousands of fact checks tells us and what you should do as a result. So partly that's going and asking people to correct the record when necessary. We've had corrections from some of the newspapers in this room. We've had a Prime Minister stand up in the House of Commons and tell opposition MP, the previous Prime Minister David Cameron, tell an opposition MP, the honourable member should listen to Full Fact and shut up. We've had the same Prime Minister 3 months later print a correction in Hansard for something he said at Prime Minister's questions, and that's an important additional service. But the thing beyond that is then looking at where systematically does misinformation come from and how can we intervene to make it less likely and make it less damaging. And so, for example, I've recently been at the Select Committee on Political Polling and Digital Media, at the Committee for Standards in Public Life, trying to explain empirically what we know about how this works and what can be done to fix it. And one of the, to many people, boring sides of our work is working with places like the Office for National Statistics to get official sources of information to communicate much better, which I hope you may have seen improvements in recent years, and some of them are thanks to the work Full Fact has put in, helping the government statisticians to communicate better, and I hope that that has benefited journalists in all of your organisations. So we do a very wide range of work. Some of it is absolutely classic journalism, some of it is much more like campaigning and advocacy work in a very narrow and specific field. And some of that clearly belongs in the charity sector. Some of it, I think, I would wish to see more in newsrooms like yours, and I think if we're going to earn the trust of the next generation, maybe we need to see more of it as well.
Okay, just picking up, Keith, on that point, how does a regional newspaper survive in the new world of journalism where clickbait is everything, and despite perhaps the best efforts of companies like Google to sift out fake news, you know, how are you going to get the best stories in front of your readers and keep going when we know the ad revenue is, you know, is geared towards clickbait? How are you going to address that?
I think Will makes a good point about safeguards in the newsroom, and you know, I think the risk in the regionals is twofold. Firstly, you've got the pressure to get content online more quickly than before, so you've got reporters out in field reporting from incidents, taking information from unverified sources, which is suddenly out there and published before the news desk or anybody sensible has had a chance to look at it. So God knows what appears. The good news about that is something that can be taken down and got down quite quickly, but it still needs to be checked. And sometimes you're running live blogs and away they go. So that time pressure to get content online is an issue. I think there's also a pressure in the industry in terms of resources. And the skill set and experienced news editors out there who can smell trouble and just look at something and know that, you know, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And your traditional fact checkers, really, looking around the room, people should remember this, that the first fact checker should be the reporter, then it should go through the chief reporter, the news editor, subs, and you know, in the glory days, we had a proofreader sat there checking everything was spelled right and all the rest of. And if your readers now are your fact checkers, then you know you're already in trouble. It's too late. And it's important. The important thing with that is it's not just to protect us from legal action, but also to protect the credibility, not just of your organisation, but also the industry in the long term. Because, as I said at the top, the regional press in particular is one of the most trusted news sources in the country. But each restructure that eats away at our resources puts us at greater risk. I say not just as individual titles, but also in the industry itself. And I think where we're fortunate, the Express and Star, is that we've still got specialists. We still have an investigations editor, political editor, people like that, who can really drill down and get into things and understand and know who their contacts are, and be able to verify and authenticate tips and information that comes in. Because without that, if you get a call from Johnny Smith who pretends to be a local councillor and you take that as legit and you don't even bother to check out who it is, then it starts at that very first point of contact. And what we're trying to drill into reporters now is that it's more important than ever. Try and use technology to Skype people and make sure you double check with their identities, or use FaceTime, or do whatever it takes to make sure that things that when I started out and looking around the room when people started out, you'd go and see these people face to face, so you knew who they were. You'd go to the council meeting and you'd know what these people look like and who they were. And these days, actually Google makes it easier, Pete, because we can check out who they are on Google Images, etc. But there's still an important responsibility for us to do that, and it starts at the first level with the reporter.
Peter, could you pick up a little bit on the technology aspect in all of this? Because obviously a lot of the talk around, trying to influence election campaigns, looking east particularly, has been the role of the so-called bots in pumping this misinformation out in front of people at an alarming rate. And how can you talk a little bit about how Google is going to tackle that element of things, opposed to the humans as well?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a little bit of a pity that Facebook aren't here, because I would just stress that that our model versus those of some of the other social media companies is very different. So we're not in a situation where we have micro-targeting. Yeah. We don't have dark posts or anything like that. So it's the point really about Google's position in all of this is that we make our mistakes in public. We're clearly working very, very hard to make sure that we're delivering relevant results. But bear in mind we're handling billions of queries. 15% of the queries that we receive every day we've never seen before. And if there's a terror incident or a shooting incident or something like that can sometimes throw up inappropriate content because we haven't seen those terms before. But what happens is that although maybe a very small number of people would make that query and receive those results, the news of the occasional mistake obviously goes around the world, so that concentrates our minds very, very strongly.
Okay, I think it might be time to open this feverish debate up to the audience, who no doubt have some tough questions for everyone on the panel. I don't know who up there has got the microphone, if everyone has questions.
Thanks. Peter, I'll throw this one your way because Facebook aren't here, but but it's the role of the algorithm over the human. We had the absurd thing about 18 months, 2 years ago from Norway, where a safeguard designed against paedophile images ended up with the famous Vietnam War girl with the napalm victim was actually removed because it was the algorithm suggested this was in fact an obscene child image photograph. This ended up involving the Norwegian Prime Minister, but it took 3 days, I think, or even 4 days before that was restored by Facebook. I'm sorry they're not here, so I'm throwing it your way as the expert who can explain that.
Yeah, well, look, it's an interesting case, and it illustrates the difficulty and the nuance in terms of taking down inappropriate content. So, for example, on YouTube, we have guidelines, and we remove content when flagged. If those guidelines are broken, of course, that covers illegal content, child sexual abuse imagery, terror content, or whatever. But it's extremely important to understand the context. And people put us under a lot of pressure to say, can't you do more to remove inappropriate content? What we do is we make sure that although we can use algorithms and machines to flag the content, that we actually have human reviewers who ultimately make the final decision. And so we've had this many times in the context of
correctly, Facebook, again it's Facebook not you, but had actually dispensed with their human checking system. I think they've now partly restored it, but at that stage I think they'd actually got rid of it.
Yeah, couldn't possibly comment about what our friends at Facebook do, but I think it's a very important point because if you think about terror, for example, you very often have documentaries about ISIS. You might have counter speech videos, and you don't want to be in a situation where you're wrongly taking down that kind of content.
I think the other thing with Facebook is that the Facebook flag, perhaps, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it? It flags up stories that are thought to be fake news, but it doesn't specifically then point out that it lends credibility perhaps to ones that aren't flagged up simply because they haven't gone through the same algorithm. And it also doesn't remove them, it just pushes them further down the newsfeed. Unfortunately, Facebook aren't here.
It's worth saying on that particular scheme, so Facebook, as many of you will know, have a scheme where it is possible to flag a post and say, I think it's wrong, and for Facebook to refer it to third-party fact checkers. As far as I know, that's only running in the US, France and Germany, so it's not my problem, Gov. On the first question, though, I think it's really interesting to ask the question of how would that be different if it had been a junior member of staff who made the original erroneous decision rather than an algorithm? Because so much is changing at the moment, it's very hard to get a hold on what are genuinely new questions that need policy responses and need answers, and what are actually the same old questions that we've seen before that need the same old answers. In that particular case, I think it's an illustration of Facebook suffering from the fact that every decision they make about a particular piece of content is in some sense also making policy about what's okay and what's not. And at the moment, a lot of those policy decisions are being made by the big online platforms and embedded in online platforms' terms and conditions. There is a debate that has to be had about to what extent those decisions should be being made in democratically accountable places and embedded in democratic functions. For example, when it comes to the rules around advertising transparency at election time, full fact is absolutely clear, but that should be set out in law. The rules for election campaigning should be set out in law and not in online platforms' terms and conditions. In other areas, it's much harder to know. But because effectively Facebook's decision on that image is making what amounts in practice to law for millions of billions of internet users, no wonder it's careful. You would be too in those shoes. But whether it should be stuck with that decision in quite that way, I don't have an answer to, but I think it's perhaps the question we need to be asking. Yeah,
I mean, it's worth just adding to that point, which is that, we've seen, for example, in Germany, where they've brought in a law around hate speech, which means that tech companies can be fined for not removing illegal content quickly enough. Now, on the face of it, that might seem like a good idea, but the danger with that is, as Will says, that if you have tech companies, big and small, faced with the possibility of big fines, they would very quickly, I think, move to a situation where they would just remove against any flag for fear of being fined. So the free expression implications of that are quite serious.
Hi, Paul Horrocks, former SOE president. My question relates also to Google and what Ronan Harris said last night, and you just repeated it, Peter, that Google are not arbiters of truth. Now, if you're supporting the fight for real news, my question is, why not?
Well, we obviously want to take people to authoritative and relevant content. So we put a lot of effort in place to surface high-quality journalism, etc. But if you think about the trillions of separate pages that exist on the web, being updated and replenished at an extraordinary rate, hundreds of thousands of new sites being added every day. That's the web, and anyone can upload content to the web at any time of the day or night, anywhere on Earth. The idea that any tech company or any player should be charged with overseeing that vast array of material and deciding what is true and what is false, apart from anything else, is an extraordinarily difficult task. But I don't think anyone would want to a private
but you can
company
accept that
to take on that.
There's a huge volume of
undertaking.
content out there, I get that. But there are certain stories that you have got the technology to track what's trending, etc. Big stories, you know, ridiculous one, Pope backs Brexit, etc. Quickly, why are those stories, why are those sorts of headline-grabbing stories, not the local tittle-tattle that may be wrong or right, the headline-grabbing stories, once it's obvious that they're out there and they're getting the oxygen of publicity, why does Google not ask the question, is this true?
Well, actually, our algorithms do precisely that, and I mentioned the changes that we've made in algorithms aimed at surfacing high-quality content and demoting content which is bogus or of low quality. And actually, somebody mentioned at Ronan's speech last night the story relating to NASA and the signs of the zodiac, suggesting that somehow NASA had added a new sign of the zodiac. I looked that up last night, and actually at the top of the rankings are no, NASA is not changing the zodiac. So the first number of stories are all correct, and then the original Cosmopolitan story, which caused the furore, is way down the bottom. So yes, in terms of thinking about how the user interacts, searching for stories, we very much are interested in surfacing the stuff that's true and relevant. But trying to arbitrate across the entire web, that's not for us.
Picking up Keith's point, why does it take so long to check these things out? Once it's brought to your attention that something is not true, as Keith Harrison just pointed out, why does it take 3 days to get it corrected?
Well, you're talking about some different things there. What Keith was talking about was an erroneous piece, which they said we want to remove from the web. We want to remove from Google search. Actually, algorithmically, it doesn't take long at all to realize that stories are being replaced by corrections, and that rises to the top.
Can I ask a question, Pete?
Sure.
I mean, yesterday as well, Ronan Harris said that Google isn't quote an unregulated Wild West. Well, who does regulate you?
The law of the land. So whether it's copyright or libel, terror content, we are regulated by the law in the same way as any publisher is.
So do you think that the Leveson recommendation should apply to Google?
Well, then of course every conversation here is imbued with this backdrop of Leveson. But that's the point that Ronan was making last night, is that what we are doing as a search engine is so very different from what a publisher does. You curate and handle a finite number of pages every day. What we're trying to do is, in a fraction of a second, give you a relevant answer to potentially infinite number of searches every day. And we handle billions of searches every day. As I mentioned, 15% of those have never been seen before. So we're doing a very, very different task. And if you were in a situation where each video that was surfaced in YouTube, or each result that was surfaced in Google search had to be checked by a lawyer or an editor before it was surfaced, then of course you can see that the entire model of the web wouldn't function.
This platform versus publisher debate worries me a bit. I mean, speaking as a publisher for a second, if we decide that Google, Facebook, Twitter are all publishers, and we know that government is going to be doing something about Google, Facebook and Twitter, whatever it ends up being, well, if they're all in the same bracket that all the rest of us are when all that law kicks in, you never know what's going to come back and hit you in the face. I actually think that these platform and publisher aren't good enough conceptual categories for what we're dealing with. We are dealing with something completely new. Government, Parliament is historically rubbish at dealing with new communication technology. I mean, this is the industry that survived the licensing of the printing press. I mean, for 400 years, Parliament has been rubbish at dealing with new communication technology. The next step needs to be clearer definitions of what we're talking about, and I think it has to be something slightly more sophisticated than are you a platform or are you a publisher? And in particular, I think Facebook and social media, you can have two people using exactly the same technological functionality for two completely different purposes in two completely different contexts. And I think that's all going to need teasing out. into much clearer definitions before we get anywhere sensible on legal responsibilities. For those of you who haven't seen it, First Draft at Harvard, who we worked with at the election, Claire Wardle's group, have just published an excellent report for the Council of Europe, which is trying to clear up some of the concepts in this debate. And although it's reasonably hard work to read, I think it moves us a lot closer to having some sensible categories to work with. And we should all be afraid of what happens if lawmakers do things with too broad categories, because we'll probably be affected too.
Well, what's the difference, Will, between the Express and Star publishing something on their Twitter feed, and which we could be sued for if it's wrong, and Joe Public publishing something? Because, you know, we've gone from essentially in the past 20 years 5,000 publishers to potentially 60 million publishers.
Right.
And at some point, I think Joe Public is going to lose his house. You know, the Sally Bercow case, you know, and it's going to take something like that for people to realise that this isn't. And at that point, then it's going to become, that's the only time we're going to be able to tackle this unregulated Wild West, as it were.
Well, I think those are the right kinds of questions to be asking, and I think they need to be asked from two sides, because at the moment everything I ever hear about is the problem of fake news. We're also living with the opportunity of everyone being a publisher, everyone having the opportunity to share their views and experiences and holiday pictures and everything else, and both of those need to be navigated. But at the end of the day, one lone individual can post something. Actually did during the election. One of the most important fact checks we did was by a grassroots conservative activist, a big Twitter table of a big image table of government spending when the Conservatives arrived and when they left. It spread more than most of the official campaigning, and that was a completely ad hoc effort by one guy. So the world is changing around us, and the law is.
We've got to be quicker on our feet.
Yeah, a little bit. But we've also got to be careful, because rather like terrorism, actually the scale of a response to the issue dwarfs potentially the issue itself. And so it's possible to do more damage by responding to it than the original problem is actually causing. So again, I'm still waiting to hear people really get a sensible definition of what the problem is and what does distinguish you from Joe Public and so on and so forth.
So really, I mean, you know, from what everyone's been saying, from the questions from the floor so far, I mean, we're really, let's be honest, a long way from being able to solve these problems. And so I suppose I close out, unless there are any more questions, by asking the three of you, really, what if it doesn't go away? How are we going to, you know, what does 2018 look like? You know, we've got Brexit debate still going on. You know, the government looking incredibly fragile. We've got elections in other European countries. You know, how right now can you guarantee to the readers sort of in the middle there, who don't have a partisan view of the world, that they're going to be served well by independent and factual journalism?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, most people have identified news publishers that they trust. Most people don't agree with all the other people about which publishers those are, and that's an issue, but most people have publishers that they do trust, that they have checked over time and sussed out for themselves. And that is, you know, the great hope that the members of the Society of Editors bring, that you can be trusted brands in the future of news. I think that if you look at how the internet works, actually being able to do corrections promptly is such a vital signal of trust that sorting out that particular scenario seems like a really valuable exemplar of a solvable problem in this space. The other thing that I think is really missing is links to sources. The fact that journalists online are not doing that at the moment is missing such an obvious opportunity to build trust with your audience. So those are, I think, simple things to remember the value of the news brand and how to reinforce that online. The thing that, were we to have an election next year, and I say on a completely non-partisan basis, I'm knackered and I really hope not. But leaving that aside, if we do have it again, the most striking thing for me is just how much news publishers are being bypassed. The political parties can go straight to their publics with no scrutiny. And that is actually by far the biggest threat. Everyone's a publisher means your prime minister, your president, your leader of the opposition is a publisher without scrutiny. And we're only beginning to see how much we're losing.
So do you think it's incumbent on journalists to call out politicians for being liars, or to call out Donald Trump for being a liar, or is it up to Google and Facebook and Twitter to do that?
Why did you get into journalism if it wasn't to hold power to account?
But who's going to get the word out faster?
That's a great question. I'm really not sure. I mean, obviously journalists should be holding power to account. That's what it's there for. Journalism is there to have a go at people. I don't see that as Google's role. I see Google's role as sourcing reliable information for people. I see Facebook's role as helping people have trusted conversations. I would be very interested to hear your take on how far you think Google should be along that line. But I mean, I understand why Twitter haven't closed Donald Trump's Twitter account, put it that way.
I just think that I can see Ian Murray getting very sort of, we're up against the clock. But the only thing I would say is that do our jobs properly. If we want to be trusted media, we've got to earn that trust. And that means what differentiates us from Joe Public on Twitter is that readers have an expectation, particularly in print when they pay their 65 pence a night, that what they're reading is factual and accurate and it's gone through a verification process. So go back to what I said right at the top, is that if we do our jobs properly, we can combat fake news quite easily.
Yeah, I would just say this is an unending, ongoing battle. It's not going to be resolved neatly. But if you look at the experience with spam over the years, I think for most users, we have very satisfactorily resolved the issue of spam, making the experience a sort of deeply messy one. So all the tech companies are very, very focused in getting to a much better place on this. I think we're making progress across the board. And then the second half of the equation is what we're talking about here, which is working together in partnership with journalists, local journalists and national publishers to create a better ecosystem for news across the board.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone. Sorry we've run over time slightly, and I think maybe if everyone goes off and finds a PR account for Facebook, you know what to do. Your questions can be directed there directly, perhaps en masse. But thank you very much to everyone for participating. I'm sure people have further questions, and for Peter and Keith and Will, they can go and find them at the lunchtime buffet. Thanks very much. Thank you.